Welcome. This is Pastor Bob Douglas, coming to you again with some thought-provoking ideas, thought starters, basic principles, whatever you want to call them. This morning is going to be just a little bit different because I was presented with a question. And it got things started in my mind and my heart that I thought was worth a conversation with you. The question was this: what was something that you believed all through childhood and were surprised to find out was false? False. True. What I thought was true, found to be false. The search for what's true and what isn't true is a lifelong quest. And there aren't many things that a child understands that an adult would agree. You can start with the Easter Bunny or leprechauns or anything else you'd like to start talking about. The world of a child is it's a childhood picture of fantasy because we don't have a lot of reality that comes into play. We have to get experience before we can actually judge reality. And so very often, Paul writes in the New Testament, when I was a child, I thought as a child, I believed as a child, I acted like a child, but when I became an adult, I put away childish things. You know, I certainly have plenty of those. But one of the things I can tell you is, being a pastor's son, I saw the tremendous cost that the ministry caused my father. It was a painful profession. It was a difficult ministry for a variety of things. It was just painful to love people, to want the best for people, to hold out your hand to say, here's what can make your life better, and then just have people slap it away. It's difficult. And I believed, growing up, that I couldn't possibly endure that kind of a ministry. It just wasn't possible. I did not have that kind of courage or strength. Well, as it ended up, rather than finding that to be false, I found it to be even more true than I knew at the time. You see, standing up for truth is painful. Terribly, terribly painful. People accuse you of the most atrocious things. They cannot understand why someone would do or say things that are so much different than what is generally accepted as being true. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Well, if God loved the world, why would there be so much pain? You know, you can't say God loves the world and send his son when there's so much evil and death. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and how can God so love when And yet right in the middle of all of that pain and all of that difficulty, Jesus said, for God, our Father in heaven, so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Okay, let's just think about what is real and what isn't. What's permanent? What lasts? Here's what I know to be true. Jesus Christ called himself in Scripture the light of the world. And in the Gospel of John specifically, I mean, he has the most references to Jesus being the light. There are 23 separate references to Jesus being the light. I am the light of the world, the way, the truth, the life. All of those things are what he described himself to be. The bread of life, the manna that supplies every need every day. He had a number of those things, but the light is a very important one, because in a dark place, in a dark room, you turn all the lights off at night, a light makes all the difference in the world about what we can see and know. I wake up often in the middle of the night, and our bedroom is fairly dark. But there is a nightlight out in the hallway, and just a little shine comes underneath the bedroom door. From that little tiny light out in the hallway, but that one tiny little bit of radiance allows me to get up and around and move through a dark room where I can't make anything else out because there's a light. I believe the one thing that I have held on to as being the permanent thing that is true is that Jesus is the light. It is the illumination. It is the truth. It is the one thing that pushes back the darkness. It pushes away the darkness. And it stands forever as the truth. What will last? What is permanent? My grandpa used to sell lawn and garden equipment. He didn't seem to worry too much about something that was going to spoil on him. He used to laugh. He said, "I don't sell bananas." To sell bananas, I guess, is his definition of being in the most temporary kind of business. Your product goes bad pretty quickly. He thought his would last better. Didn't spoil. And yet, after being in business that way for 20 years, it ended up we put a whole lot of his material into the scrapyard because anyone who's ever had a lawnmower realizes they don't last forever. It was his way of saying, my stuff won't go bad right away. But time will tell you that it will eventually fail. So what's true? When I went to school, there was a fad, sort of a momentary shift in how people thought or believed, that everything that was written in the Bible was just a fable, a story. Peter Rabbit, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and all bundled together with the idea of something that actually happened 2,000 years ago or more, and just a waste of space for our current life because it just was just stories made up. When I went to seminary, there was a big fight going on about whether or not the stories of Jesus were actually based on fact or on fantasy. And we had a New Testament professor at that point who'd just come back sabbatical. And he had decided that in his year of study that Jesus had done none of those miraculous things that are recorded in Scripture. I'm walking on the water. Here, I'm walking on the water. No, it's just foolishness. That was stuff that was made up hundreds of years after he had been taken off the scene by followers who were trying to make him look more important or more powerful or more impressive than he actually had been. There was no making water into wine. I mean, that was just meaningless. The virgin birth was just a story to make it sound like he was more impressive, more divine than he had been. It was quite a thing. And when you start questioning that and you start thinking about it, one of the biggest issues that we were dealing with right then was the concept of an open marriage. You can Google that, I guess, but one of the things I guess I would say is your promise to be faithful to that one individual until death separates you is meaningless. It's not tied to anything. And you ought to be, in the open marriage concept, allowed to do anything you want to do with anyone you choose to do it with, and nobody should get upset about it. They were trying to promote that. They said Jesus was just a man who was trying to get beauty and some sort of concept of something other than God's eternal plan. He was just an interesting teacher. And you strip out all the miracles, you strip out all of the miraculous things that happened, and that's the core of who he is. I mean, it just, the Beatitudes are good ideas, and they should be applied as much as you can be, but the whole idea of the miraculous was being taught as just being foolish. And so it was quite distressing to say, okay, I grew up in a pastor's family, and I'd grown up with Daniel in the lion's den as being a part of my experience. And they said, no, Daniel in the lion's den. No, it never happened. That also meant that when his enemies were thrown in the lion's den, they weren't ripped apart and killed before they even hit the ground. So that's, seems like it's easier to believe. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't go into a fiery furnace and come out not even smelling like smoke. Don't worry about all that. That's foolishness. I mean, there was no Noah's Ark. That's just a story that is told, like Jack and the Beanstalk. What's true? What's true? What isn't? My own personal search for what was true, what wasn't just a childhood belief, I was in my second year of seminary. My mother and father had a ministry that they had where they took groups of people to Israel, Jordan, Egypt, those faraway places that you read about. And he would take people to these faraway places and would show them where it actually happened. It was in my second year of seminary, 1977, when he offered to take my wife and I, my brother and his wife, with him on this magnificent trip. And we were excited to go. It was something really life-changing. It was a big event. We got on the big 747, flew across the Atlantic, landed in Amsterdam, spent some time looking at the windmills and clogging around in wooden shoes, and then we landed in Tel Aviv, Israel. It was already starting to get dark, so we got in a tour bus and we climbed up the mountains to the city of Jerusalem and checked into our hotel there in Jerusalem, what had been the old YMCA building. We went up to the top floor where we were going to have some supper. It was very late. I mean, it was dark, it's black every place. And I wasn't really hungry. Certainly not as hungry as I was curious. And I drifted out of the dining hall and ended up walking out on the balcony that looks south, out over the city of Jerusalem as it is today. And the city of Jerusalem has a number of places that are lighted up very brightly with very high intensity lights, and other places that are very dark and unlighted in any way. And I was looking out there trying to get my mind located as to where everything was, or to get an idea of where I was. And it wasn't very long until my dad came out and joined me out on the balcony. And with his experience and knowing where everything was located, he would just point and he'd say, okay, now that's over there in that dark spot. That's has no light on it, but that's where Jesus was crucified. Call it Calvary or Golgotha. And that's the city gate down there, all lighted up, the whole city of Jerusalem on the north wall. It was lighted with very bright lights. And he said, that's the Damascus gate. That's the marketplace for all of the city of Jerusalem. And then the Temple Mount was behind that, over top of the wall, and you could see the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock over there, and there were big lights out over onto the Mount of Olives. And I said, it's almost too hard to believe that here I stand on this balcony, looking over actual places that I read about, thought about, prayed about, taught the stories over and over and over again. And I'm actually looking at the place. It's a real place. Dad smiled and said, yeah. That's why I brought you here. So the next day, it wasn't very nice. It was cold, cold, cold. We were not dressed for the cold February. 1977. It was a cold, rainy, I mean to tell you, I'd brought my camera and everything, but the light jacket that I had that was supposed to be just, enough for the morning chill was now keeping me dry, and I had my camera stuffed down inside my jacket so it wouldn't get wet, and it was cold, nasty. And of course, that was the day we were going to go see some of the very special places in Jerusalem. And the first one on the list was the Garden Tomb. And it was the place where there was a special garden with a wine press, an olive press, a water system, and then carved directly into the mountain itself, carved directly into the face of the cliff on the side of the garden, was a brand new tomb with a gigantic stone that had been, first of all, cut away from the cliff and then rolled to the side, where Jesus had been buried. We were there for a little while, but you shivered and shook to the point where you couldn't really stand it very well. So we went on and saw other places, and out in the sunshine it was better. But the next day, we went on our tour for other places, and it was very interesting, very stimulating. But the sun was so warm, and the sun was so bright, that my brother, all four of us together, the little group, decided this would be the perfect time to go back and revisit the Garden Tomb. So when it was time for us to go back to the hotel and have lunch, and we were going to spend an hour or so in the top floor of that hotel again, we sneaked off and went down to the Garden Tomb. And just as we got to the Garden Tomb, about 5 or 6 blocks down the street from where we were staying, the lady was just closing the door, the big steel doors that closed up that area that they had set aside there. And we just, oh, it's closed. We had so looked forward to being able to see it in the sunshine and the warmth. And the lady was so understanding. She said, yes, I remember your group being in here yesterday, and it was a miserable day. There's no question about that. How about if I unlock the door and let you 4 people, just the 4, inside, then I'm going to lock the door again until I have my own lunch, and when I come back in an hour, I'll let you back out. Oh, that was wonderful. And so the 4 of us spent nearly exactly an hour in the Garden Tomb area, and we were looking around first and kind of walking the little paths around everything. You'd see the structures and things inside the garden and the beautiful flowers. That wasn't what really interested in me. That wasn't really what I was interested in. I ended up sitting on a bench directly opposite from the hole in the cliff. And I was just sitting there reminding myself what it must have been like on that Friday afternoon, so many years ago. Jesus had been tried through the night. In the early morning, he was brought to Pilate. Pilate interviewed him and decided he didn't really want anything to do with it, sent him to Herod Agrippa, Herod Antipas, and Jesus wouldn't even speak to him. Herod sent him back to Pilate. Pilate took him inside, had a long conversation with him. It's recorded in the Gospel of John. Fascinating stuff. I mean, amazing. Pilate comes out to the crowd and says, I don't find anything this man has done worthy of death. I don't see anything that he's said or done that makes me the least bit uncomfortable. There's no violation of law here. And, of course, the crowd shouts, "Give us Barabbas, and what do you want us to do with your Messiah? Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And the whole event of the Passion of Jesus goes up to a new high level. He's given 39 lashes, and each lash has like 3 different thongs. They're little leather straps with a metal barb on the end of it that rips into the flesh, and he was given 39 of those slaps with that leather thong with the barbs on it. And you realize that that pierced every single part of his body. They used it so creatively, they made every part of his arms, his shoulders, his back, his thighs, his legs, his calves, every part of him had been exposed to the lash. And every one of those places where the thongs had hooked into his skin had been torn and ripped and cut. 39 lashes times, let's say, 3 straps to that lash, and then hundreds of wounds to his body. And then the crown of thorns was woven over his head. And they took what we would know today as cattails, kind of the thick, heavy reeds that grow up in the moisture, and they swacked him over the head on top of that crown of thorns, driving the thorns down into his scalp and piercing the flesh. And then giving him a cross and telling him to carry it up the hill out to the place just outside the city wall called Golgotha. And all the things they did to him there, piercing his hands and his feet with nails, making him hang there in agony for 3 hours. That wasn't quite the end of the story, though, because as he finished his 3-hour ordeal, he cried out, "It is complete. Into your hands I commend my spirit." And he died. Pilate couldn't believe he was already dead. 3 hours is not a long time for a Roman crucifixion, but none of them had beatings first. I mean, let's be honest, he'd been through quite an ordeal even before. And there he was. They weren't sure he was dead, so the soldier was given the task of taking a lance or a spear and jabbing him on the right side, sort of up underneath the bottom rib, and up through the chest cavity, through the left or through the right lung, and then pierced his heart with the lance. And out of that hole through the side of his body, blood and water ran out and down on the ground, just to guarantee that he was, in fact, dead. That was late on Friday afternoon. At that point of the evening where your eyes stop being able to perceive colors and they go back to just seeing black and white. You have rods and cones in your eye retina. Some of them are for perceiving what light and color gives you, but as the darkness comes, those stop working and you go back to just seeing more of a gray or black and white. Well, at that point, when you stop being able to see color, is called sundown, and that was the beginning of the Passover Sabbath. So everything had to be done. I mean, every single preparation of what they were going to do with Jesus from the time that he is confirmed to being dead on the cross to being buried and sealed had to be done in that span of time from something like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, getting permission from Pilate to take down his body, getting it down, carried at the 400 yards or so from Calvary down the hill and around to the tomb. They laid his body sort of out on the ground in front of the tomb because there was no time to take him to somebody's house. They had to do it in a hurry. It had to be done quickly. The marketplace is just another 400 yards down the road there, so they went in and got 75 pounds of herbs and spices and the cloths and everything they needed for the burial. They came back, and in that span of time between his death and the final moments of light of that Friday, they did what they could to kind of straighten him out because he had died hanging on a cross, suspended from the nails in his arms and kind of all crunched up. So they laid him out on this long cloth that was twice as long as it needed to be to cover his body. So from his feet up to his head, and then they wrapped the cloth up over him and back down to his feet. And they put a cloth over his face because of the burial customs of that day, and then wrapped that long cloth up over him, the burial clothes. And then they took a strip of cloth, maybe 3 inches wide, 2.5, 3 inches wide, and they wrapped around and around and around that bundle that had the 75 pounds of herbs and things all pushed in around his body. And all the places where his flesh had been pierced were all running out of blood and bodily fluids. And they couldn't wipe it fast enough to, clean his body, so they just wrapped it all up together. It would have looked something like what you and I might see in Egypt as being one of the mummies, although it wasn't like that at all. He wasn't mummified or anything. He was just wrapped up in this bundle of cloth, tightly pulled together so that he could be more easily carried. And with extremely loving care, carried into that new tomb where no one had ever been buried before. It was brand new. It wasn't even quite finished. And laid on the stone slab that had been prepared. Now, the traditional way of being in a tomb was that the bones and the remains of previous generations would have been lying in that same spot, and all they would do is just move those to the side to have the new body laid down. But in Jesus' case, he was sitting there all by himself, stretched out with this wrap of cloth and tightly bundled together. And then they left, And they rolled this gigantic stone down in front of the door of the tomb. It was on an inclined groove so that gravity would help bring the stone down to the end of that channel and across the bottom of the door of the tomb. And then, because there were possibilities that he would be stolen and then claimed that somebody had taken his body, and then they couldn't confirm whether he was dead or alive, they had soldiers stationed right there in front of the tomb itself. It sounds weird now. I mean, why would you put a armed guard in front of a grave site? But the soldiers were given the responsibility of making sure nobody moved that stone. And so they pounded iron spikes into the limestone of the cliff so that it could either be tied or chained in some way to make sure that the stone would never be moved while they watched night and day. And there I stood opposite that place. The preparations for the body, seeing the wounds in his scalp, on his face where they pounded him, on his flesh where they had whipped him and scourged him, the nails that they had used in his hands and feet, the spear that had pierced him, the work that they had to do so quickly to try and get him prepared, the absolute certainty that he was forever dead. The one that they loved so much and respected so much, admired, worshipped, and now was gone. And it occurred to me that this one spot, this one place, in all of the entire world, should never have had anything happen after that. I could envision people coming up and looking at the tomb, the stone rolled across the front of it, like we might if we were going to go and see the tomb of George Washington or Ulysses S. Grant or any of the other people of massive influence in our life, in our history, our country, our nation, our faith. We look at where their bodies are laid and we remember what they did and what they said, what they accomplished. But it shouldn't have changed. And yet, that one spot, instead of being forever a tomb, was only a tomb for 3 days. Because at the very crack of dawn, at the very first radiance of light, so that you could see color again in your eyes, Jesus turned his body from a lump of rotting flesh to being a completely new body. He transformed his flesh and blood tissues, the stuff that had made him a real human being. He transformed it into a body that had no more lash marks. It had no more marks upon the forehead and the scalp. It had no more ripping and tearing of all of the tissues in every area of his body. And the only thing that remained were the holes in his hands and wrists, in his feet, and the place where the spear pierced his side. They remained. And he released himself from the grave clothes and left them behind in the tomb. And walked out under his own power. First time in history that it ever happened. The only time in history we know that to be true. The events were so traumatic that the hardened soldiers fell to the ground, pretending to be dead, hoping that they wouldn't actually be killed for their part in this whole story. They just shivered and shook in fear on the ground. And Jesus walked out unaided and without any kind of conflict. He just walked out on his own. Now you think about that for a second, as I did back in February of 1977. How could that have happened? How could that have taken place? We're absolutely guaranteed that that is an accurate description of what took place. It's been recorded in every kind of historical document, even the stories of the soldiers being paid off to tell that he had been stolen away by his disciples. But all of that does nothing but confirm that it's actually true. It just seems like the most incredible thing. We don't have a Zapruder film like we have of JFK's assassination, but we have the first-hand testimony of people who are just completely astounded by what they're being told. He's alive, he's spoken to Mary, he's revealed himself, and then he's not there, and we have this wonderful rapid-fire series of events where on that Sunday afternoon he walks all the way from Jerusalem to Emmaus with two of his disciples, explaining why it had to happen exactly as it happened. But they didn't recognize him as being Jesus until he broke the bread for their evening meal. And then suddenly it was clear that's who it was. And then we have that story of Jesus coming into that locked room, that upper room, all the doors and windows barred, and he stands in front of his disciples, encourages them to ask him questions, shares with them, don't be afraid, it's me. 7 days later, he holds his hands out so that Thomas can put his fingers in the nail holes in his flesh and put his fingers into the place in his side where the spear went through. I want you to know for sure, Thomas. I want you to be able to know. There are going to be millions upon millions of people who don't have a chance to put their fingers in the nail holes. But if they see that you did, then they can know that it would be the same for them if they had a chance to. And what was Thomas's reaction? He simply shouted, "My Lord and my God." He knew it was true. He knew it was true. So we can know it's true. Once you start with that as a basis of what you understand, and you begin to build on top of that the importance of what he said and what he did, that he knew he was going to be building a brand new structure that we call the church, the ecclesia, the ones that he has called. Once we start building upon the foundation of what he showed us to be true, eternally, permanently, forever true, nothing else seems that difficult to believe. Making bread and fish enough to feed 5,000 people doesn't seem that tough. Changing 30 gallons of water into good wine doesn't seem that amazing anymore. Impossible. And walking on the water, it's a joke. I mean, you don't have to worry about that at all. It's just saying to the winds and the waves, be quiet. And just like rowdy children, you see, the one thing that I believed was too hard to do, I couldn't do it, was that I could have the strength, the courage, the fortitude to stand up for a whole lifetime and say to people, I love you enough to tell you the truth, as hard as it is to hear, as difficult as it is to get your mind around it. When God called me, he said, you can't do this. You already know it. You already have admitted over and over and over again the fact that you couldn't possibly endure for a whole lifetime the stresses and strains of loving people, being betrayed, being abused, having things stolen from you, having the most amazing lies told about you, having your friends that you believed would always be your friends, who turned their back on you and called you a loser. That's hard. It's very hard. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the strength that you need. That's what he said. And if you let me give you the strength, you will see that we will accomplish great things. What's true? The truth is that Jesus Christ is the light that forces the darkness into the corners. And there are times when the darkness comes out in force, when the lies, mistruth, twisted up truth that you think is something that is, oh look, we've discovered what's really true. Conspiracy theories and all the different things that creep up. I remember people in times long ago said, we've decided we're going to believe all of the mysterious things that Revelation has to show us about what's going to happen in the end time. Come and join us and be a part of this discovery of the fulfillment of prophecy. And I said, no, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm going to stay with what I know is true. The one who was the truth. You see, in the end, that's the only thing that does not spoil and rot and get thrown away. It doesn't get trashed. It stays permanent, unchangeable. The message of Jesus Christ, the one and only Son of the Father in heaven, the one who came to prove God's eternal plan of salvation. That's what I started with as a child, even though I understood it in a childish way, and came to understand was more true than anything else that I've ever learned in life. This is what lasts. Thank you for giving me a chance to share some of my story with you. God bless you.